Yeah, that's it. That's it, really. We can talk a bit more about those if there are questions or anything specific.
Awesome. And I'm Josh. And by the way, Ben saying that he's been here for 3 years is actually at Redpanda a big deal, because Redpanda has only been around for like, he probably joined right around the time that Redpanda started, I guess.
Yeah, I was kind of counting the years, like, and I felt like, yeah, I think you're pretty senior in Redpanda's term, right?
I mean, and
Yeah,
so
about 8 people on the call when I first joined.
I feel like an old timer in some ways. And my 1-year anniversary was yesterday.
Oh,
So,
congratulations.
Yeah, so, but just to give you some perspective in 3 years versus 1 year. But yeah, I'm Josh Purcell. I work in customer success. Ben is in engineering. My focus is to work with, I mean, anyone using Redpanda, doesn't necessarily have to be a customer, and just help them understand how Redpanda can work within their solution and solve a problem for them. And in the process, I do a lot of different things, including when I first started, for like the first half of this last year, I was pretty much exclusively focused on Kubernetes and the Helm chart. So yeah, that's my background.
You two are very humble. I think you are the two go-to expert that I would always ask in Redpanda, because you know everything. Like every single time when I have a question, you know the answers. That's why I reached out to both of you and ask you, like, since you have so many people reaching out to you for questions, do you want to talk to us a little bit about some of the pitfalls that you see people doing when they started using Redpanda? Like some of the things that you see, very common things that people make mistakes on.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, we can. So how would you want to start talking about that topic? We can.
Do you want to start, Josh, then, since you're here? Do you want to talk one or what things, and then we'll hand it over to Ben to one questions, and we'll hand it over to your side, and maybe we can do some discussions over your pitfalls.
Just kind of go back and forth.
Yes.
Well, I mean, the first thing I was thinking of was that I see often, and because I've been primarily focused on the Helm chart, is external access in the Helm chart. It seems like it's been a common issue where people don't know exactly how to use the Helm chart to configure it so that you have proper external access. The issue is that the Helm chart by itself, it can only do so much, and depending on where your Kubernetes environment is, whether it's on the cloud or locally or like self-hosted, whatever, you have to have access to the nodes, or and it also depends on which service you're using. So in the Helm chart today, we have 2 different services. Node port is the default, and that could also be a gotcha for users initially, because if node port is the default external access, then you need to be able to access the nodes. And if you are in a lockdown environment in your organization, in your AWS or GCP cloud environment, or just for different security reasons, maybe you don't have access to the node, then you'll have to use some other route. The other option we have is load balancer service, and that makes it for some people easier. You get like another IP address that isn't tied to your node, and you're able to access that IP address, or DNS address, depending on how you have, again, your Kubernetes environment set up. On AWS and GCP, I think the default is different. If I remember correctly, on AWS, a load balancer will get, I need to look into this, but I believe one environment, you'll get an IP address, and the other environment, you'll get a DNS name. But either way, you have the ability. It's up to your Kubernetes environment to hand you a load balancer endpoint. And so you don't want to enable that if you are running in a Kubernetes environment. Say maybe it's an air-gapped, self-hosted Rancher environment that you needed to install something like Metal LB to get a load balancer service within your Kubernetes environment. If you don't have that, then just switching the load balancer flag, the external type parameter within our values.yaml to load balancer, then you'll end up in a state where everything on the Redpanda side is set up appropriately, but your load balancer service in Kubernetes will sit there pending, not ever getting an address So not all of the process around external access is up to the Helm chart. So that's probably another one of the big reasons why people will run into issues in that area.
So can I summarize that if you're trying to access your Redpanda services externally from Kubernetes, like if you bump into, if you're using no port, then it would be the networking issue that you need to look into, like the port, if you have access to the node. But if you're working on load balancers, it means that you probably need to set up some load balancer policies in order to actually access to that. Is that how did I summarize it right? So people can look for problems when they try to say, if they set up load balancers, they couldn't figure out what's going on. These would be the things that they look into first.
Well, okay, you mentioned policy. So with load balancer, there's not really usually a policy like security or IAM change or a security group change that you need to make, because it's given to you by the AWS or GCP cloud environment, and so you will be. They're going to give you an address that you are able to connect to, but by default. But with the default node port service. Mm-hmm. Is something that you would need to go in and ensure that your route tables and that you have access to the node port service, which is again where like many people will run into problems. They hope that by enabling external access, that's in the values.yaml of the Helm chart, that's all they have to do, but that's not all they have to do, and it totally depends on your cloud environment and how you make sure your route table is set up. So we have some details in our documentation around what you need to do, but because those details are external to Redpanda and the Helm chart and dependent on your cloud environment, they're not like 100% prescriptive, but they lead you in the right directions on what you need to do in several different scenarios. I think we focus on Azure, GCP, and AWS.
Yeah, that's great. And then if you after you check the documentations, after installations, if you still have the problems, you're welcome to come to our Slack channel and ask the questions. What kind of information would you like to see before they ask? I think there's one of the things that I often see is that people ask questions on Slack, but we need to ask them for more information. And what kind of information would be great if that people can give to us in order to kind of get us more insights into what's going on, like with the problems?
Well, with external access, many times one of the first clients that they use to get access to Redpanda is RPK, which is the CLI that we have for Redpanda. So some of the questions that we many times will have to ask whenever someone comes in for problems with this external access issue is what cloud provider they're running. Where is your Kubernetes environment? Is it a cloud provider, or is it local, or Minikube, or kind, or whatever? Which type of external access you're trying to get working, node port or load balancer. And then also, where is your RPK client? Or if you're not using RPK, are you running an some other Kafka client that is external, I assume, right? It's probably external. And then the other thing that this may bring up a larger discussion that we could talk about, but Redpanda has the ability to have multiple different listeners. So there's different services on the single Redpanda binary. The Kafka service, there's Schema registry, HTTP proxy, admin. But for Kafka in particular, and some of the other services, you can have multiple different listeners. So that means that there's multiple different ports that would handle those requests. And the reason you would have that is for maybe you wanted to have certain application, maybe like one application would always go to a single port that's different from some other application. And that port could have TLS enabled or SASL, different security set up so that only that one application or only those certain clients would have access there. So, and you can set all that up via Helm chart, via the values.yaml, making sure that listeners are defined and customized how you need it to. But that would, I guess the best way to answer the question, about those differences is just maybe like giving the values.yaml file would be the easiest thing, because that will give us all the information we need in terms of how the listeners are configured. The last thing is your Helm chart version, like which version are you using, and that will tell us also the Redpanda version, because there's a link, by default. You can override this, but by default, a Helm chart version will always install a specific Redpanda version. So which Helm chart version combined with the values.yaml file that you're using is usually enough to help us get you in the right direction.
That is really good to know. Thank you. And Ben, what about you? What is the first thing that you see, a very common pitfall that you see people do? Like anything?
Yeah, I mean it's basically the same thing. So the reason that you have to set this, the reason it's difficult is because the clients, Kafka clients, have to talk to each of the brokers.
Mhm.
So when you set up the seed address, it will connect to one of the brokers, and then the first request is, where are the other brokers? And so they need to advertise where they are, and depending on where the client runs versus where they are, they might not even be on the same subnet. And different external locations might have different routes in as well. So you have to set the advertised address, be it the end of the load balancer or the node port or whatever that is. And one reason for having multiple listeners is if you have different routes in that are contactable by different addresses, whether it be an IP address or a DNS address. So yeah, that's mostly where people struggle, even if they're running it on Docker Compose locally, because depending on your machine, if it's Windows or Mac, I think it runs in Docker Desktop, and you don't have bridged networking, so it's always like a different subnet. And so you can have them working if you're running the binary sort of locally, but as soon as you put it on a different subnet, people struggle to connect. Or they
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because that's what actually I think 30% of the use case when we go to Slack, people ask that question. So what do you think that's the best case? What is the best way to test it before we actually get clients connecting to it? Is it a suggested method that you want to for people to kind of check and see if that advertised address is actually well configured and all that? Is there any suggested way that you think is better?
Yeah, I think it comes back to RPK. I forget what the command is, but maybe RPK cluster info.
Uh-huh.
If you do the -- brokers and then you put a -v on it, it will tell you where it tries to connect. And if you know that the list of those places that it tries to connect to are not routable from the client, then that's your problem, and you need to set up an advertised address.
Yeah. In other words, that command RPK cluster info, you can target it to any one of your brokers. And so since the advertised listener is per broker, you can I don't know if you would want to do this, but you could actually set it differently. So it may make sense to actually send RPK cluster info to each of the brokers, depending on how you deployed Redpanda, to make sure that advertised listeners that come back, it'll be printed out in the output of RPK cluster info is those addresses, and the port is actually accessible from whatever external client you're using.
And that comes another question, because I assume the advertised address would be a little bit complicated when it gets to the Kubernetes environment, right? Like when you have a Kubernetes environment, then everything's get complicated, because then you have the node port, you have the load balancer. How do I configure that right? And how do I change things? And is there any suggestions on that?
I mean, it can be more complicated, but because if you're using the Helm chart, in some way it's less complicated, because you now have, it's handling the deployment, right? So if you have a values.yaml configured in a certain way, you're always going to end up with a deployment that has this proper configuration. So it can be more complicated if you don't use Helm chart or the operator, but you have to think about more regardless. If you end up running into some crazy issue, there is going to be a node, and then there's going to be a container with pods, and you have to ensure that the networking is set up in Kubernetes properly. But that's outside of Redpanda, and usually not the issue. I mean, it depends on that. I mean, like it does bring up something interesting, because Kubernetes, there's a lot of different Kubernetes environments. It would be, it's easy for us to say we support Kubernetes deployments, but then Kubernetes, there's many different environments and they aren't all exactly the same. So, and then that doesn't even take into account, the nodes that you're running on and the performance and the capabilities on those nodes. So, but that also, in terms of what nodes Redpanda gets deployed to, that's configurable in the Helm chart. So you will not run into as many problems there if you are configuring the values.yaml to say I can only deploy on nodes with certain amount of resources. And many times we have customers or users who will actually use taint and tolerations, and to make sure that certain nodes are the only ones that are being used by Redpanda. I don't know if we want to go into this now or not, but sometimes that can be important for production usage because of performance. And there's this, Redpanda has this tuning capability that the Helm chart will do for you, or it can make sure that this is ran on the different nodes. But there's part of the tuning that needs to be done on the node itself. And that is going to ensure that the disk is ready, is capable and in the state that's best, and the kernel is in the state that's best for running Redpanda. So you can imagine how that could be, you would want to taint those nodes when you do this performance, because you want to guarantee that Redpanda is going to be the app running on those nodes.
Right, absolutely. I think that's something that people should always look out for when they do production. But for like testing environment, is it still necessarily, or is it more like a production type of?
Yeah, it's definitely a production thing. It's not for dev purposes. There's a flag for Redpanda that is, I think it's called development. I forget the name. Development mode equals true, I think.
I think so.
So that is, I think if you look at our Docker examples and the quick start guides on our documentation,
there's an over provision and there's a dev mode, I think.
Yeah, dev mode true and over provision, and both of those would be in combination. That would be like a really good development, running on your laptop type thing. And over provision, just real quickly, maybe Ben, you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Right.
Yeah, and I think because that's another probably quite a common one is resource usage, because Redpanda likes to use all of your machine by default. So especially if you're in development, you'll want to use this dev mode or whatever the flag is, I forget, and that will sort of limit the amount of resources that the Redpanda uses. There are some performance limitations there, but it's mostly fine. The other one is it will try to use all of your CPUs, and so people find that they don't have enough memory for that. They've got more CPUs than they have, because we require about 2 gigabytes per core as a minimum. But it's quite efficient on CPU, so you can limit it to 1 CPU or 2 CPUs, and it will probably still run pretty fast. That's probably the next biggest one that people struggle with. Is like, I don't have enough memory. Why not? I've got 48 gigs, and it's like, yes, but you have 48 cores. So yeah, definitely limit the cores. I think the Helm chart does that for you. But if you're running it in Docker Compose or without the Helm chart, then or even I don't know what the default in the Helm chart is. It's probably,
I think it's 2.5 gigs per core. So that, like, the default is, I believe, I need to look it up. I'll look it up instead of just giving a number that could be wrong.
But it's worth telling it to use a specific number, of course.
So for development, it will be easy. It will be much faster and easier. So it's not taking your entire computer's resource by just like assigning 1 CPU and then like a certain amount of memory for your Redpanda use case, right? Because what I like about that when I was developing, because I'm a developer, I like it because it's like super lightweight. I can have it running like right compared to having a lot of things, configurations and all that. So I think that, but I didn't. When I first played with it, I didn't know I have to kind of limit the amount of CPUs, And then the problem of my computer, I don't think it stopped, but I think it kind of stopped some of my thread running. So it was taking turns. So my thread is kind of like, taking its turn on a list, very, very limited amount of like threads. And like Redpanda is like, it's kind of taking over the entire other thread. So it has a very limited. So I was wondering, like, why is this thread not running? And why is this process not running? That's what happened to me.
Yeah. So the default is 1 core and 2.5 gigabytes of memory. And so, but then, right above that default, we say for production, use 4 or greater cores, and then for memory, use 10 gigabytes. It really give as much memory as you can, because Redpanda will use that memory, but the very minimum that you want to do is like 2.5 gigabytes per core.
Perfect. So I want to ask Ben for another one. Like, do you have another one that you want to share with us?
I think they're the top ones. That's like half of all queries.
Yeah, I think you're right there. What about you, Josh? Like, did you have any more pitfall that you often see people?
Well, for day one operations, like, how much memory and CPU and the types of things that we talked about, like we covered a lot of that.
Right.
For day two operation, there's a whole host of other issues. So like one of the biggest things that it comes back to is monitoring, being able to monitor like when you have a Redpanda cluster up, it can be a complicated system. We try to make it as simple as possible. But if you want to be able to send, for your use case scenario, you want to send a certain amount of throughput and latency and a certain number of clients connected to it. And you get to the point where you may not know ahead of time on day one how big your cluster needs to be for, day two. And so being able to monitor that is really important. We've been working on, so we have 2 different endpoints that Redpanda, so Redpanda has this admin API, and on the admin API route, or like port, there's an endpoint for metrics. There's 2 different endpoints for metrics. One is metrics, which is an older, it's the original. You think of it as like the fire hose, where there's not a lot of aggregation going on. It has it's very noisy. It may be very difficult for users of Redpanda to like get the specific information that they want out of that. So we came up with a new endpoint called public_metrics, and that has more aggregation going on. It's less of a fire hose. You're able to easier get to like relevant information for what you need to be able to know about your applications and use of Redpanda. And so we also have, and so these endpoints spit out Prometheus ready metrics, right? And so you can have a Prometheus server that is pointed at those endpoints, and then it will be able to make use of that and provide it to other tools such as Grafana. And for Grafana, we have dashboards available that you can just, they're in the Grafana dashboard. I guess it's a repository, but we also have a GitHub repo where you can just download the JSON from there. And so you can.
I was able to find a dashboard on Grafana dashboard. I can just type in Redpanda, it will just pop up for me. So
exactly. There could be 5 different dashboards right now, and one that
last time I checked, it was only 4. You added another one?
Well, there's one that's like the older default, right? So if you have,
is that the one?
and
Okay.
then there's 4 new ones that are. So if you're using RPK and you look at all of the capabilities, the subcommands on RPK, one of them is RPK generate dashboard, and so or generate Grafana dashboard, I think. And so that will generate a dashboards, and you can actually end up giving it a name of a dashboard, and it will generate different ones. Originally, before that, so the name of the dashboard is a new feature coming out in the next version of Redpanda 23.2. But right now, if you look at the capability, it will generate a single dashboard. And that dashboard is good, it's in the right direction, but it doesn't have all of the capabilities of all the other dashboards. And you can't use RPK generate Grafana dashboard today to generate those other dashboards. So that's why if you want those dashboards today, you can just go out, get our observability repo under our Redpanda data organization in GitHub, or go to Grafana dashboards and just type in Redpanda, and you'll see not just that one dashboard that RPK generates today, but all 5 of the dashboards that you will be able to generate from RPK in the next version.
On the side note, I really like how we categorize it, right? Because we have a centralized view of all the clusters, and then we also have a view of the producers and another view of the consumers, as I can recall, right? So it gives me like different type of views, and if I know something is wrong with my consumers, I can know I can go to the consumer view and I can see what's going on inside there. That's kind of how I like it, and how I like how it is categorized. Kind of like just, I think that's what I like about it.
Yeah, and in terms of figuring out like the throughput, how your Redpanda cluster is performing, the Redpanda ops dashboard's probably a really good start for that point, because it'll give you CPU utilization, storage, throughput, latency numbers, just like a overview, basically.
That kind of gives a good segue into some of the questions I've gathered earlier on some of the things people want us to answer. So I'm just going to read them out. So this person says, I have a high throughput producer. What would be some producer configurations I could use for the high throughput producers? Because if we're looking into our dashboard and the producer it has a very high throughput. So how do I configure that to make it perform better, a little bit better?
Is there anyone on the call who has any specific questions?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Okay. Anybody has any questions or anything I want to kind of discuss, and we can bring it up.
Hi Ben, and hi Josh. This is Dunit. This has been a great session. Thanks for putting it together. So I have this question. Just imagine I'm a net new to streaming and real-time data, and I'm quite new to these partitions and topics and this Kafka protocol as well. So my question is, as a beginner user, how can I determine the right amount of number of partitions for a given topic? I mean, I've seen that several users struggle with a single partition, while some others did unnecessarily create large number of partitions and they stuck at the performance. So what's the right amount, the Goldilocks number?
It's a really easy question and very difficult to answer. So the way that topics and partitions work, really topics don't really exist, right? Only partitions exist, and partitions have an ordering. Topics are just a grouping of partitions, and so if you need your messages to have a particular order, they must go on a single partition. So a partition becomes the unit of scale. So typically we'll find that consumers will take longer to process the messages than it takes to produce them, or for Redpanda to process them. So if your consumers can't keep up with the rate of a single partition, or the messages on a partition, then you'll need multiple consumers. But you can't have multiple consumers on a single partition, so that's when you scale up the number of partitions that you need. But you have to bear in mind that if you need an ordering, when you produce, you need to choose which partitions those messages go to, so the ordering remains. So really, it comes down to how fast your consumers can consume the data and process it. So if you're producing at 10 a second and your consumers take 2, I've made the maths difficult, and your consumers take 2 seconds to process, you're going to need quite a few partitions to sort of process that, right?
Yeah.
If your producers are really fast and your consumers are really slow, then you'll need more consumers, but then you want to make sure you have partitions for each of those consumers so that you spread out and make it faster for consumption.
Do you think the number of replications should go down when we have more partitions, because then the internal traffics will be more for copying, for replicating, you know?
Yeah, it's a separate topic because the replication factor comes down to durability of the data on the disk, and availability if a node goes down. So every partition in Redpanda is a raft group. So if you want to be able to write to a partition and you have a replication factor of 3, then as long as 2 of the nodes or more than half of the nodes are up, you can write to the partition and consume from it. So that's great. So really the replication factor comes down to tolerating loss of nodes. So it comes down to the availability of a given partition, or any partition really, with the replication factor. And if you lose the machine entirely and its disk, then you want a replication factor greater than 1.
Right. Sorry about the segue, but it's coming back to the ordering of your consumers and the data, right? So should I assume that when I have a really like order intent, I need to actually make sure all the ordering of my data, and that I need to kind of figure out the keys as well? Like, how does that kind of work with the partitions, and how do I decide on how things can be used? Kind of any strategies around that as well?
Yeah. So yeah, so when you have all these different like partitions in a specific topic, the way that you would be able to ensure. So say you have a job that's going to be many different from maybe across different producers or on a single producer. It doesn't really matter at that point if they're all going to the same topic. But say some of them are all part of an overall job, and you need to make sure that the order of the messages that are related to that job are all, the order is respected. Then if there's multiple partitions in the topic, how is that done? It's done through keys. So you have to make sure that when you are producing that information, the key is the same, identical across all of those messages that are related to that single job. And then that guarantees that all of those messages will be in the same partition on the topic that the producer is producing to. And and so then you could have a scenario where you would have all these different jobs, and you don't really know which partition it's going to. You just know that all messages that are related to that single job are going to be in order, because they are all going to be on whatever the same partition is, in that topic. And so that kind of separates the need to know when you're producing to a topic how many partitions there are. You just need to make sure that the key is the same, and you'll know it's always going to be in the right order for consumers.
That's really good to know. Does that answer your question, Jonathan?
Jonathan is on mute.
Sorry. Yes. Thanks, Ben and Josh. That really helps. Sorry.
So any follow-up questions, or we can kind of go back to any other question from the group? Anything you want to ask? Any questions that you have regarding to Redpanda, like things that you wanted to get it out of your chest, like things that you have problems with and you want us to answer? There's no dumb questions. There's no hard questions. Just, ask it out, and we're happy to answer them. This is the whole idea of the office hour, right? We're here to answer your questions. We're happy to take in any, or if you want to hear any of our thoughts or any discussions you want to have in this group, we're very welcome to have.
I think it would be cool to have, like maybe this be some type of a podcast. I guess the problem is, we would need to have a clear format, like, maybe know exactly what we're going to be going through. But at the same time, that could still be open for a lot of audience participation throughout. QA, could be an ongoing process throughout that, but then it would be available on YouTube later on. or something.
I am recording this session, so this one will be on YouTube. So hopefully we can kind of have this ongoing thing and have all the questions answered there. So I'm doing that. I don't know if podcast would be great, because then with podcast it's just us recording, so we cannot have people interacting with us. Well, I'm hoping in the future people will be coming into the sessions and start asking questions, and we'll have more interactive experiences for this one. So that's my hope for the future of the office hour. But depending on the communities and how active everybody's are, we'll see.
Yeah,
I have to plant some people in the audience to ask some questions.
there you go. And I'll start posting. We should all start posting details about this to social media if we have it.
I think what we can do is we can cut some of the things that you've answered out as snippet, and then have it out and socialize it, and maybe we can attract more people coming to the office hours. I think that would be very helpful. And hopefully in the future we can invite some of the our customers, or like the Slack community, any members, to come and talk about their implementation of Redpanda and how they're using it in their own environment. That would be also interesting to hear.
Speaking of that, I think it would be, I'm thinking about how it was when I was learning about Redpanda, and like I was joining all things like this, right? It would have been great if this was something that was available when before I became an employee. But one thing I would really like to see is discussions around future features and like what is planned for the future. So that could be we could spend a whole office hours on something like that potentially.
Sorry. Last time when I invited Alessandro, I actually wanted to talk. I want him to talk about the. Oh, sorry.
No worries. Alejandro is the one of our Kubernetes team members, and were you going to say operator?
Yes.
Yeah.
I want him to talk about operator, like kind of the roadmap and where everything's going from that end, and kind of give us a sneak peek of what is going on there. And because Helm chart is great, I love Helm chart, but I think for the GitLab stories, Helm chart is a little bit lacking there, because there's a continuous management, continuous operating that of your environment, and Helm chart just does the first provisioning of the things. And I want to see like continuous improvement or continuous management for that, and I don't see that happening for Helm chart. So if we can incorporate the operators into the story, and that will give us a better like administration experiences for that.
Yeah. That is true, and I hear that all the time whenever I'm looking into like people in Kubernetes generally, not Redpanda specifically, talking about the differences between the Helm chart and the operator. They say many times that the operator is really good at and meant for the day 2 operations and the managing of it over time. But I see how the Helm chart with Redpanda combined with RPK, and how we can just run RPK commands to modify different things about the cluster. We could, have Helm handle that in some ways. They could, in other words, we could do a Helm upgrade to modify things about the cluster. And so it wouldn't be the same exact thing as like using the operator, maybe not as clean of a separation, or ease of use may be a little bit different. But I see how a lot of the management of a cluster we could improve on how the Helm chart is able to do that.
I think so. I think it's just the way that people operate on Kubernetes is they would assume, because I think it's the Argo CD thing they're trying to do, where they're trying to monitor everything as resource. And that's why they want to go with operators, because operator allows you to kind of have everything configured and then monitor as resource and XML, YAML stuff for that, right? And with Helm chart, then you have to manually push that change. I mean, you can always do that like automatically. I think there's a way of doing that, right? I mean, there's no different right way or wrong way. It's just like people's preferred way. And I think it's just a hype where not everybody wants to do that. And that's why people are switching to it, I guess.
Yeah. Another muddying of the waters there is like you could use, so infrastructure, one of the benefits of GitOps is infrastructure as code, right?
Yeah.
Well, imagine like, so there's a scenario with the Helm chart and Terraform, where you could have the Terraform control the Helm chart and values.yaml. You could have, and then Terraform could be your infrastructure as code. So it's like it's not. I just keep finding like, ways that you could. I don't know why I'm trying to avoid the operator, but I'm just like maybe sticking with the Helm chart because that's what I'm more familiar with. But I see how it could be.
Because it's different tools for different personas. Because if you are a person that's setting up EKS or the Kubernetes, Helm chart and maybe Terraform will be your go-to tools. But for people managing EKS, like the day two people that goes into and just run Kubernetes, I think they're not so familiar with Terraforms because they're not familiar with all the networkings and disks and all that. So I think they're afraid of using that tool. That's why they invented another thing. I don't know. It's my own opinion on that. I don't know.
Also, like, did you start off in the Kubernetes ecosystem and you use the tools that are popular in the Kubernetes ecosystem? Like almost all operators are written in Golang versus there's no reason other than that's just what people, the ecosystem, the community has decided. But yeah, I mean, this in terms of like talking about future features and things, there is something, a project I'm working on that I've been threatening to get done for a long time, but it's a Terraform project that controls the Helm chart, and it will deploy an EKS cluster or a Azure cluster, whatever you depending on what cloud provider you want to use, and then it will use the Helm chart to deploy on top of that. And it's all just
similar to BYOC that we do, where we have a Helm chart that sets up the entire stack for the cloud.
Well, yeah, both of our cloud offerings, BYOC and dedicated, use Terraform under the covers to make it work. BYOC, the early version of BYOC, in fact, we would just give Terraform to our customers. They would run Terraform to get the part of BYOC set up that is within their cloud infrastructure. But the new version doesn't follow that same model. But Terraform is still used in the background to get things set up. So yes, I think I haven't looked at the code on that side, but I think it is very similar of an approach.
Okay, I see.
Just to wade into the Helm chart versus operator. The Helm chart creates Kubernetes resources, and Kubernetes has operators to keep them up to date and in sync. I think the operator would be useful if we had other custom resources such as users, ACLs, topics, and then the operator could try and keep those in sync. That's sort of think where you would move, like where an operator would become more useful when you have resources that Kubernetes doesn't know about.
Yeah.
And this is all like we're talking about Helm and operator. Maybe Alejandro talked about this last week. I'm not entirely sure, but I know that version 2 of the operator, or like the next version of the operator, there's going to be much less of a distinction between the Helm chart path and the operator path. In fact, they're saying that it's going to be the same path.
I think what I heard from him was that the second version of the operator will be using the Helm. So basically, it's running Helm underneath the hood, and then basically, but it's in operator mode. I don't know how they make it work, but I assume it's very similar to a Helm operator. I don't know, like that might be the case. I'm not sure, but it sounded more like that.
Ooh.
Perfect. So I think we're on the almost the end of our office hour. This is a 45-minute sessions, and I feel like we didn't get through all of the things we want to cover, but I mean, I might invite you to both again, maybe in a month or two. So kind of just have you come back and kind of, because I love this discussion that we're having right now, and I'd love to dive deeper into that as well. So thank you very much for coming to the office hours, and thank you all. So I'm gonna do. We don't have a lot of people here for the draw, so Antoine, you get the prize. Easy,
Nice.
right?
What's the price?
It's a T-shirt. It's a Redpanda T-shirt. Can you, Antoine, when you have a time, can you send me your email address, and I will send the T-shirt for you. And that's all we have for today. I'm going to stop recording, and thank you very much for